Yeah, hi from my side again. Yeah, in the beginning, it's going to be about history a bit. Um, Despite I told you, Leon, that I won't tell anything, but a few slides so people can join and won't miss much. So today we're going to talk about psychosis. Linking clinical practice and theory is the subtitle. So I'm trying to lead you through the diagnostic criteria of psychosis and approaches to etiology and modeling approaches. And then in the last part, I'm going to show you a bit of our work from the lab, what we've doing in the field of we've been doing in the field of psychosis so far. Yeah, so we jump right into history time. So a few slides about the people who shaped the term schizophrenia or psychosis, just that everybody knows them and knows what they said, because yeah, some of the things that have been decided in the 19th or 20th century still have influence on the nosology of the disorder today. So yeah, maybe we should keep that in mind and to critically assess those things. Yeah, first of all, Emil Kraepelin, 1887, said that, or introduced the term dementia precox, which is basically the term for, or the term that was introduced for schizophrenia, and kind of the history of schizophrenia is the history of psychiatry. So this was a first approach to describe this disorder as a premature aging or a dementia. And there the question was raised if yeah, the people getting this disorder, if they have a rapid cognitive decline in the late teens or early adulthood, and this was the core feature of the disease. Yeah, so, and at this point, even Emil Kraepelin just divided this, or made a separation between the manic depressive psychosis, which is present in bipolar disorder, and the dementia precox, which is then later defined as schizophrenia. So he is making this difference that is still current in classification systems. So the second guy was Eugen Bleuler, another black and white picture of the white male of this time. Yeah, so he said that first of all, it's not called dementia precox because it's not a cognitive disorder itself. It's called schizophrenia, and it's a biological process. So the dementia was, according to Eugen Bleuler, just a secondary symptom, and below that, biological processes are making up this disorder. And he is starting to separate between the personality parts, the cognitive parts, memory parts, and perceptual parts of this disorder. And he's also saying that this is a disorder of dissociation, and the negative symptoms are the core feature of the disorder. It's that we come across these this wording again later. Okay, then in the 1920s, Kurt Schneider introduced the systematics of the nosology, which is still present in the current classification systems, DSM-5 and ICD-10. And yeah, he claims that psychosis is the core feature of schizophrenia, and what that does, we will see later as well. So this was the groundwork for the classification systems, and he ranked the symptoms into auditory hallucinations, experiences of passiveness, thought withdrawal, thought insertion, thought broadcasting, delusional perception, and such things. So those all are contents of the definition of psychosis. So there's a short timeline. In the first place, the term psychosis was derived from the Greek word for abnormal condition of the mind. You see that, yeah, from the linguistic part, this term is a really broad definition. And before the 1980s, psychosis was meant for impaired mental function or the impaired capacity to meet the demands of life. So it's basically synonymous to a psychological disorder, so a mental disorder, which then was tried to be described in more precision in the DSM-4, 1994, with a narrow schizophrenia concept. And currently, there is the need to deconstruct this concept of schizophrenia and psychosis into etiologically different dimensions, because this is a broad and heterogenic disease. So currently there are approaches to deconstruct this disorder and to cluster it into different maybe dimensions. So as you can see, it is a quite broad definition of the term psychosis, and it is still arguable that this is not the best the best definition in DSM-5 or ICD-11. So there's a need to do further research into this nosology of the disorder. All right. So we've talked about history and some of the concepts. So now we will define them in a semantic manner. And bear with me, there's a lot of text and a lot of definitions, but I think it's really important to know what's behind this term and what is meant by this, and what's the difference between psychosis and schizophrenia, and all those questions we might come across the work with things. All right. So first of all, I don't know if everybody knows what a mental disorder is. So it's a syndrome characterized by clinically significant disturbances in an individual's cognition, emotion regulation, or behavior that reflects a dysfunction in the psychological, biological, or developmental processes underlying mental function. So mental disorders are usually associated with significant distress or disability in social, occupational, or other important activities. Here you can see the analogy to the psychosis definition in the 1980s. Okay, so you need to note that there could be a culturally approved response to a common stressor or loss. So it is not everything that is associated with a disability in social activities is not a disorder. So it has to be compared with some sort of norm. So there's also a socially deviant behavior, which are between individuals and society, which are not in fact mental disorders, unless the mental disorder unless the deviance results in a disability in social, occupational, or other important activities, basically. So that is the definition of mental disorders in DSM-5. And now we can go into schizophrenia spectrum and other psychotic disorders, which are listed under the term mental disorders. So basically, there are abnormalities in those 5 domains. First, delusions, hallucinations, disorganized thinking or speech, disorganized motor behavior, and there's another part which is more relating to schizophrenia. Those are the negative symptoms. So psychosis is generally used as an operational definition of transition to schizophrenia, but there is less systematic occurrence in other disorders. So you have to keep that in mind, that psychosis is not solely linked to schizophrenia. So there are 3 different kinds of psychoses. It's first of all the idiopathic psychosis, which comes from the inside basically. So there's no other external influence that is leading to psychosis. For example, medical conditions, brain injuries, or head trauma, or toxic psychosis for intoxication of certain substances. So this is a differentiation, and all 3 kinds of psychoses, those 5 domains, could be present. So first of all, delusions. There are different kinds of delusions, but all of them are fixed beliefs that will not change if somebody is presented with conflicting evidence. So, for example, there are persecutory delusions, that I believe that one is going to be harmed, harassed, or by an individual, organization, or group, and this is most common, despite there is no evidence that that the person is persecuted in any way. Then there are referential delusions. It's the belief that certain gestures, comments, or chats are directed to oneself. So if you are in the train and people are talking, you constantly think that they're talking about you, even if there's no evidence that they're not looking at you or something. Then there are grandiose delusions. That means then when an individual believes that he or she has exceptional abilities or exceptional wealth or fame, even despite they haven't. Then there are erotomanic delusions, that believe that those are beliefs that another person is in love with him or her. Those are also seen. Nihilistic delusions involve the conviction that a major catastrophe will occur, and somatic delusions that focus on preoccupations regarding health and organ functions. So those are the main types of delusions, and they are deemed bizarre if they are clearly implausible. So in case of the persecutory delusions, if one is thinking that he or she is followed by the police or spied on, this is basically plausible. But if somebody thinks that everybody in the world has removed and rechanged to aliens or something, this is clearly impossible, and therefore those delusions are deemed bizarre. So, for example, the thought insertion, when you think that your own thoughts are inserted by another person or another institution. So, all the delusions of control, that you're controlled by another force. All right. It has to be said that this is a spectrum, and in 1/3 of the general population, those delusions can occur without a disorder. So everybody has some referential thoughts sometime, but this doesn't have to be a disorder. So, yeah, I think 30% of the population report significant feelings of suspiciousness and even persecutory ideas about work or government, and including those ideas of preference. The second abnormality is hallucinations. Those are perception-like experiences which are vivid and clear and occur without an external stimulus. And they are not under voluntary control, and they can occur in any sensory modality. But the most common are auditory hallucinations. which I mostly experience as unfamiliar voices or familiar voices that appear distinct from the individual's own thoughts. And as you can see here, and not just to the delusions in healthy people, 5 to 15% experience at least one auditory hallucination. So this doesn't make up the whole disorder, but you can see clearly an increase in the population of patients with schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. To take a closer look at the auditory verbal hallucinations, there is an increased activation in neural networks referring to the parietal lobe, the left hippocampus, parahippocampal region, the left superior temporal gyrus, and the Broca area. So those are bilateral neural networks that refer to auditory areas, autobiographical memories, and attribution of external cues. So there could be three causes of those verbal hallucinations. First, the misperception that are just produced in auditory areas, a misattribution of autobiographical memories, or a misattribution of internal conversations, so own thoughts, to external sources. So that there's a difference in like cognitive hierarchy, but in all of those systems, a malfunction can occur, so that will produce auditory verbal hallucinations. Okay, those two are the major parts of psychosis, but there are also disorganized thinking, which is also called a formal thought disorder. So you make loose associations. So the individual switches from one topic to another. Then there's a derailment, so thought derailment, tangentiality, which means that the answers to questions are not related, or not obliquely related, at least, to the questions. And then there's incoherence, which is just you can say that it's a word salad, so it doesn't make sense. The speech doesn't make sense. So, and the fourth part is the disorganized motor behavior. So this is just weird behavior, which is ranging from childlike silliness to complete unpredictable agitations, and there's many problems in goal-directed behavior. So if somebody wants to make some coffee and isn't able to get to this goal, so most of them are experience difficulties in performing activities of daily living. So this could lead to catatonic behavior, which is a complete decrease in reactivity to the environment, which leads to negativism, rigid posture, mutism or stupor, or catatonic excitement, or repeated stereotype movements. This is all under the term disorganized motor behavior. And catatonia is then a new cluster in the DSM as well. So, and last but not least, there are negative symptoms also present in psychosis, and mostly in schizophrenia, and those are less prominent in other disorders. And two negative symptoms are particularly present in schizophrenia. This is the diminished emotional expression and the avolition, so the lack of motivation. So motivated, self-initiated, purposeful activities are not made. Then there's alogia, anhedonia, and asociality as well, but those are less present in schizophrenia. So as you've seen, you have psychosis, and one may directly link it to schizophrenia, but there are other disorders listed under the schizophrenia spectrum and umbrella term of psychotic disorders. This is, for example, the delusional disorder, which is a presence of one or more delusions in a time frame of more than 1 month. There's a brief psychotic disorder, which is a presence of 1 day till 1 month. Then there's a schizophreniform disorder, which is a schizophrenia syndrome, but with a smaller time frame. Then there's schizophrenia. Then there's schizoaffective disorder, which means this is a co-occurrence of a mood episode and florid symptoms of schizophrenia. And there's at least 2 weeks of delusions, hallucinations present without prominent mood symptoms. Because if the mood symptoms are only present in are only present together with delusions or hallucinations, then it's rather a bipolar disorder with psychosis. And then there's the non-idiopathic substance or medical induced psychotic disorder. Okay, so let's talk about the criteria of schizophrenia. Sorry about the whole definition block, but I think it's really important, so bear with me. So for schizophrenia, there are 2 or more of the following symptoms during a 1 month period present, and at least one of these must be the delusions or the hallucinations. Then there's disorganized speech, grossly disorganized or catatonic behavior, or negative symptoms. Basically all the blocks of psychosis, but in this 1 month period time frame. So the qualification, so additionally to the psychosis diagnostic criteria, there must be a disturbance of level of functioning, the same as was defined in the mental disorder. So one must have a decline in functioning in areas such as work, interpersonal relations, self-care, and this is markedly below the level of the prior to the onset of the disorder. So the time course, as I said, the signs of the disturbance must persist for at least 6 months and at least 1 month of psychosis symptoms, which meet criteria A. And those may include periods of prodromal or residual symptoms, where the symptoms are not as inflicting as in the florid phase of psychotic symptoms. Then there is a differential diagnosis. So as I told you before, there's this schizoaffective disorder and depressive or bipolar disorder with psychotic features. So you have to rule them out. So then there's no major depressive or manic episode, and the occurrence with the active phase symptoms must be checked. If mood episodes are occurring, then they have to be present at a minority of the total duration of the active or residual periods of the illness. Okay, yeah, as I said, if delusions or hallucinations exclusively appear during a major depressive or manic episode, the diagnosis is depressive or bipolar disorder with psychotic features. Which leads us to the bipolar disorder. So this is also a frequent and severe and mostly recurrent mood disorder with a rather similar but a bit higher lifetime prevalence than schizophrenia. It's about 1.3 to 1.6%, and there's a high mortality with 10 to 30% suicide attempts, at least suicide attempts. Also a high heritability, 70%, and there's a close genetic association between bipolar 1 disorder and schizophrenia. We'll come to that later as well. And it's equally prevalent across sexes, and there are diverse clinical manifestations, and psychosis is often present as well in bipolar disorder. So the diagnostic criteria of bipolar disorder are at least one manic episode, and then one hypomanic or a major depressive disorder. In the bipolar 2 disorder, their criteria have to be met for at least one hypomanic episode and a major depressive episode, and no manic episodes. And as you can see on the right side, there are different courses of different diseases. So on the y-axis, there's the mood, so better mood, lower mood, and there's the time frame. Then there's the major depressive episode, which just is a dip in mood, and hopefully then afterwards there's a complete remission. Then there's the manic episodes, followed by a depressive episode, which is the criteria for bipolar 1 disorder. So there's a huge increase in mood, and after that there's this huge dip into a major depression. Then there is persistent depressive disorder and dysthymia, which is just a decline in mood. And then there's cyclothymia, which is just a regular up and down of mood below a stable baseline. Yeah. So what is a manic episode? We've talked about that. This is a diagnostic criteria for bipolar disorder, but what is it actually? It's a distinct period of abnormally and persistently elevated, expansive or irritable mood and increased goal-directed activity, and this has to be present at least 1 week. And during this week, at least 3 of the following symptoms are like an inflated self-esteem or grandiosity, a decreased need for sleep. So people in manic phases just sleep 2 or 3 hours and then feel completely rested. So it's not only not a sleep deprivation where people feel tired afterwards. So they just need 2 or 3 hours of sleep. Then they are more talkative than usual, or they have a pressure to keep talking. It's an experience of flight of ideas, or subjective thoughts, experience of thoughts that are racing. So it's constantly generating ideas and thoughts, and with a difficulty to concentrate. There's psychomotor activation, distractibility, and an excessive involvement in activities that have a high potential of painful consequences. So as you can see, there is the potential of disruptions in the functioning of daily life activities. So people don't care anymore about some duties or social relations, because they think that everything's good and buy super expensive stuff and do potentially risky things. So yeah, as I said, and this is not attributable to any substance use, so it has to be idiopathic again. Then this phases of mania are often then followed by a major depressive episode, and the criteria A symptoms are depressed mood, loss of interest or pleasure, weight loss, sleep problems, insomnia or hypersomnia, you can't sleep or you sleep way too much, that there's a psychomotor retardation or agitation, there's a feeling of loss of energy, worthlessness, and guilt, and the diminished ability to think or concentrate. Yeah, then there's yeah, suicidal ideation as well. So recurrent thoughts of death. And again, criteria B, it has to be like impairing areas of functioning, and the episode is again not attributable to another medical condition or substance intoxication. So what's then the connection between bipolar disorder and psychosis? As I said, there's a closely related genetic etiology between both disorders. They have a shared susceptibility genes, and which may lead to a predisposed dopamine dysregulation in response to social stress as a symptom. As to, yeah, you have to be careful in this, because those disorders are so broadly defined that only the bipolar 1 disorder with manic psychosis has a genetic etiological overlap with schizophrenia, but not the bipolar 1 disorder with depressive symptoms. So there are also less obvious brain structural and neuropsychological abnormalities compared to schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, and there's no effect of obstetric complications, so peri and prenatal complications that could increase the bipolar disorder risk. So we have alterations of brain structure, but less obvious. Then there is a deterioration in social and neuropsychological function, and there's stress. And yeah, we currently don't know which was first, basically. So is stress leading to the deterioration of social and neuropsychological function, or is it vice versa? So there are two theories regarding to that we come to later. So the social drift theory, or the other one we come to later. So yeah, as I told you, this is just there's a need to rethink the nosology, to rethink the clinical diagnoses. So there's one approach for dimensional assessment, so that there is a dimensional structure of psychosis with different domains. The level, number, and duration of psychotic symptoms define then the different quality of the different psychotic disorders. So we have disorganized speech, hallucination, delusions, mania, depression, impaired cognition, or negative symptoms. So those are the dimensions, and then we have 3 different patients that can be ranked on those dimensions. The first is the patient with schizophrenia, an A. So the patient displays moderate hallucinations, abnormalities of psychomotor behavior, or negative symptoms, but no negative symptoms right here. In addition, the patient has mild cognitive impairment and mania and depression, which is just equivocal. In patient B, there is most likely a schizoaffective disorder diagnosed. So there are moderate hallucinations, prominent delusions, and sorry, yeah, here. So high score of depression, mania, and impaired cognition. And the third one is the patient with deficit syndrome in schizophrenia that displays like mild hallucinations, mild delusions, moderate disorganization of speech, and no abnormalities of psychomotor behavior, and severe negative symptoms. And there is equivocal depression present, but no mania. So you see that those domains can be really different, but are all listed under the umbrella term of psychotic disorders. Okay, then there's another definition I want to share with you. this is a clinically high risk for psychosis. So individuals that are classified as clinical high risk meet the following criteria. So brief, limited psychotic symptoms that can be intermittent. They have attenuated psychotic symptoms, genetic risk or a deterioration syndrome, or basic psychotic symptoms. So the clinical high risk states capture the potentially prodromal phase, so the potential transition to psychotic disorder, because they meet some but not all of the definition criteria or attenuated criteria. Then there is this model of the disease course of patients with or people with clinical high risk state. So there are basic symptoms, then there are those attenuated positive symptoms, and there is a brief intermittent psychotic episode, but it's not lasting a week or something. And there could be the transition to psychosis, but not all subjects with clinical high risk state are transitioning them to psychosis. As you can see here, I'm jumping to the course in epidemiology. You see here the course again. Yeah, I can skip that, I guess. It's basically the same. And so you see here the clinical assessment. So they're help-seeking young subjects. Some of them are in the high-risk state population, and only about 30%, so 1/3, are transitioning to psychosis. The other ones are either not transitioning to psychosis and recover, or develop another mental disorder. So this clinical high-risk state for psychosis is an approach to early identify subjects that have a high risk of transitioning to a mental disorder or a psychotic disorder. So to the prevalence of schizophrenia, it's 1%. I told you this already in comparison with the bipolar disorder. So just a fact, so 3 medical studies students from each semester will potentially develop schizophrenia, and around 50 Charité employees already have schizophrenia, with a rate of 1 case each year based on the prevalence rates. So just to give a feeling for how prominent this disease is in the population. So 1% is seem to be low, but you will come across many people with schizophrenia in your life, basically, or that have the risk to develop schizophrenia in their life. So the prevalence is here equal between men and women, but the disease course of men is more severe. And the average onset of age is also lower, 5 years lower in men than in women. And the major risk factor has been stated to be the low socioeconomic status. So here are the 2 hypotheses, which one of them, I forgot the name previously. So there's the social causation hypothesis, that people will be driven into psychosis because of the social factors. And then there's the social drift hypothesis, that the low socioeconomic status is kind of a symptom of the disease, because social functioning is impaired. I think we can discuss which of them is more probable, but at least both of the hypotheses have its validity, I guess. Okay, Just to give you a quick overview about the risk factors of psychosis. So there are socio-demographic or parental factors, then there are perinatal or prenatal factors, then there are later factors which then can be come in place after birth. And for example, for the socioeconomic factors, there's the immigration status, a main factor, urbanicity, and the socioeconomic status of the parents, as well as the paternal age, which is above 45 years, which you can remember as a risk factor because maybe we come across a possible explanation of this risk factor of the high age of parents. Then there are perinatal factors. So the highest class of evidence is the birth in winter season, which is interesting, but I didn't came across a valid explanation for that. Low birth weights or diabetes in pregnancies, so low nutritional vitamins in prenatal or premature delivery. So this is related to obstetric stress before birth. Okay, the later factors are just childhood trauma, cannabis abuse, adult life events, virus infection, bacteria and virus infection, or traumatic brain injuries, also childhood social withdrawal, personality traits, and yeah, this is the personality factors. This ultra high risk state for psychosis, neurological soft signs, and olfactory identification ability, which is decreased in people that develop schizophrenia. The course of the schizophrenic psychosis could vary as well. So 20%, 25% will come to a complete remission. 50% experience more than one episodes, and 25% experience chronic manifestations of psychosis. And you have different courses. So the continuous, the episodic with a stable residuum, and the episodic with an increasing residuum. Just another like overview over the course of the disease in combination with risk factors. So as you've seen, there's the birth in winter, hypoxia before birth, an infection that can influence the disease course early at the beginning of birth. There's a genetic load, so there's a high heritability. In the early childhood or in the later childhood, then there's urban migration, social isolation, drug abuse, and stress that can have an impact of the course. And then between 20 and 25, most experience the first psychotic episode, yeah, which can be remittent then.
May I interrupt you because there are two questions?
Sure.
So the first one is, are there any studies from medical anthropology covering this topic? For instance, historically, bipolar disorder has always been considered a disease for people from privileged socioeconomic backgrounds.
Okay, I have to admit that I have no idea of, or I didn't came across such studies. There is definitely a bias in diagnosis of people of different socioeconomic status, but I think this status is linked to daily hassles of life. So if you have a low income, then life gets harder to, and that is stressful. And I think that is the reason why the socioeconomic status is linked to such diseases. I don't know. Is that answering your question?
I'm quite not sure because the question always states that it's more that the high socioeconomic status has been considered as typically for bipolar disorder, which I'm also not aware. So actually, I also, in my knowledge, it's quite stable. Will they become poor because of this condition, or is rather the reciprocal the case?
I think both is valid. So that the social causation theory states that they will become psychotic because they are poor, and the social drift hypothesis states that patients will become poor because of psychosis. So both of them are valid, and you can think that through. If you have a less, if you are not managing to keep up your daily living, then there could be a drift towards like unemployment or something like that. But the other way around is possible as well. You can experience social withdrawal and yeah, and stuff like that. So I hope that answers your question as well. Okay, great. The question has been answered.
This was the second question, but therefore it's now the second question is answered. I think also the first one also, and now comes another one. Isolation could still be uncoupled to income.
Sure. Yeah, sure, totally. It's just a theory. Yeah, people with high income can experience psychosis as well. But the theories about the causation is there is definitely a link to low income and psychosis, but it doesn't mean that that could be the other way around as well. Yeah, right. Okay, I think I'm going on because we have a lot to show, and please keep on writing this discussion. You can probably discuss this at the end with me together if you want to. If there's some time, I think it's quite interesting. But for now, I will just go on with the developmental processes of psychosis. So you've seen that the course and different stages of neurodevelopment can be assigned to that. So there's a brain formation, so the synaptogenesis, neurogenesis, the formation of the brain. Then there's the brain reorganization during puberty, which leads to more cortical myelination, higher plasticity, synaptic pruning, maturation. And in later life, there are processes involved that with maintenance, so housekeeping, glial support, repair processes. And here, between puberty and those maintenance phases, there could be the window of opportunity, which could where one could interfere to decrease the transition and attenuate the progression of the disorder. Okay, just I will go to the etiology, so the causes and pathophysiological features, but I will, with regards to time, not go to everything in detail. If you have any questions, please ask. This is now getting a bit super complex, so if anything is unclear, I try to give you the gist of the models, the etiological models, and please ask in the chat if something is unclear. So there's the major pathophysiological model of psychotic disorders, which is related to an altered neurotransmission and of dopamine and glutamate, which leads then to an altered excitation or inhibition balance in the brain. So you can see here a sagittal view of the brain with the hippocampus, the midbrain, the striatum, and the prefrontal cortex. And at least idiopathic psychosis, I believe, to arise from an overactivity of neurons that release glutamate onto cells in the CA1 region of the hippocampus. So the deficits in the hippocampal glutamate interneurons, sorry, okay, I'm confused as well because I'm reading a message. Shouldn't appear. Sorry. Okay. You have an overactivity of glutamate receptors, glutamatergic cells in the hippocampus, and inhibited interneurons in the hippocampus. So those interneurons are inhibitory, so they are GABAergic, and the NMDA receptors are blocked, so they don't release GABA into the dopaminergic areas of the midbrain and the corpus striatum. So the glutamate expressing pyramidal cells are increased, but they can't communicate with the interneurons. So there's an underactivation of the interneurons. And because of this understimulation, the interneurons releases less GABA, which in turn then disinhibits the pyramidal cells and causes to release more glutamate from hippocampal projections to the midbrain and to the striatum. So there's an inhibition cycle disrupted, which leads to an increase of dopaminergic transmission in other areas of the brain. So the hippocampal overactivity augments the dopamine release in the striatum, and then this projects then to the nucleus accumbens and the prefrontal cortex. And this is believed to be the main pathological model because psychotic symptoms can be induced in non-idiopathic disorders that affect those pathways. And for example, in toxic psychosis, an exogenous drug acts as an NMDA receptor antibody, and then mimicking a hypofunctioning NMDA receptor, and that leads to symptoms similar to psychotic symptoms. So that's the validation of this model. I hope I explained it well in brief. If you have any questions, please ask in the chat. Then I will go further to the genetic factors in psychosis. There's a high heritability as well, like in bipolar disorder. There's a 50% concordance between identical twins and between individuals with siblings and their siblings and parents. There's a 10 to 15 times higher risk of developing psychotic disorder if the sibling or the parent has psychotic disorder. And there's an increased overlap genetic in patients with schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, as I said. Then there are two hypotheses, but I won't go into detail. That there is a common disease, common allele hypothesis. So in common alleles, there are single nucleotide disruptions, and then there is another hypothesis, the common disease and rare allele hypothesis, that in rare alleles there are SNPs which lead to the phenotype of psychosis. Okay, another thing that has a relation to the glutamatergic and dopaminergic transmission model I showed you before, so that there is a genetic underpinnings, basically. So there are genes that are linked to schizophrenia in genome-wide association studies are, for example, the GRIN2A, GRIA1, which are making up receptors that are involved in glutamatergic transmission. And so from the GWAS genetic studies, there's also the hint that this neurotransmission is somehow pathologic. And those are protein networks that underlie those synaptic plasticity. So those ARC complexes and the proteins involved in this process will lead to up or down regulation of glutamate receptors in the synapse. But there are not only genes, there's also an environment that drives genetic processes, and the body is responding to the environment. So, but there's probably a multi-hit causation. So that's not only genetic factors that will any time lead to the onset of schizophrenia, because if that was true, we just would need genetic diagnosis, and that doesn't work out, at least for psychotic disorders. So there have to be environmental factors that in interaction with genetic factors will lead to the onset of schizophrenia. And those processes could be neurodevelopmental, for example, myelination, the interneuron maturation, or the glutamatergic synapse density, which is decreased in schizophrenia. And what is interesting is that relates back to the risk factor of high paternal age. So there could be mutations of the genome that occur with the course of age. So they are called de novo mutations. So it could possibly be the case that parents with a high age could then give the single nucleotide polymorphisms that have been developed across the course of life, then further to the offspring. So that could be one explanation of this risk factor of high paternal age. Okay, let's go on to the disturbed neurodevelopmental processes I've showed you before in this multi-hit gene environmental hypothesis that then lead to enlarged ventricles, to an alteration of interneurons, so a disinhibition, an increased pyramidal cell density, but a decreased synaptic density, and decreased myelin, and decreased anatomical asymmetry. So there are definite morphological brain changes present in schizophrenia. As you can see here, the enlarged ventricles, and that are more prominent in schizophrenia than in bipolar disorder, but you can also see brain alterations in bipolar disorder. So one gene doesn't explain the thing. So if you have one gene, then you could do this analysis and diagnose with high accuracy schizophrenia. So polygenetic risk scores have been developed, and this is because of the assumption that the genetic risk is conferred by a large number of alleles. So each one has a small effect, but in combination, a risk score can be calculated. And in case of schizophrenia, mostly genes involved in glutamatergic neurotransmission and involved in the immune system are making up the polygenetic risk score. So genes with mutations in genes involved in those processes show a higher risk in subjects to develop schizophrenia. So as you can see here, those are different cohorts, and this is the risk score. And on the y-axis, you can see the odds ratio of developing psychotic disorder. And you can see with increasing polygenetic risk score, the odds ratio then of disease transition is increasing exponentially. Okay, just another result regarding to the polygenetic risk score. You can see that high-risk clinical high-risk subjects can be can be separate between converted to psychosis and not converted to psychosis, and there's a significant difference in the polygenetic risk score, predicting the transition to psychosis in clinical high-risk subjects, compared to unaffected which have a lower PRS. This is possible in a European population, but there again in research, what often happens that Eurocentrism, or at least centrism of Western culture, strikes. So this doesn't work out for the non-European population. This maybe relies on the fact that those polygenetic risk scores are generated mainly with a population that lives in Europe. But for the European population, you can clearly see probability of remaining psychosis-free. So this is the other way around. The probability to not transition declines with time and with different classes of polygenetic risk score values. Great. Then there's another explanation, like next to this glutamatergic transmission, there are also neuroimmune mechanisms present in schizophrenia. So inflammation or immune dysfunction might then contribute to the symptoms of psychosis. So this is mainly based on cytokine effects, which disrupt neurotransmission and synaptic plasticity via the glutamatergic transmission. So some cytokines act as NMDA receptor antagonists. So internally, would disturb the whole transmission process I told you before. It is also shown that anti-inflammatory drugs show promising results in schizophrenia, but it is not there's not great evidence so far. So maybe it's again based on the broad description of the disease and the disorder, which should have to be, or which has to be clustered before into disorder clusters that are related to inflammation and those that have other etiological factors leading to the same process of glutamatergic disruption. This is a bit overkill now, but basically this is an interesting current study that links perfectly the transmission cycle of disrupted GABAergic interneurons and a shift in excitement and excitatory inhibitory balance via the astrocyte and immune system activity, which is disinhibited which is also disinhibited. But I won't go into detail because this is really current work, but this is just to tell you that there are models combining immune factors and neurotransmission models into one big etiological models of schizophrenia or psychosis. Just a summary, there's a variety of disorders. The overlap between affective psychosis is symptomatic and genetic. For example, bipolar disorder with focus on like mania psychoses. There's also symptomatic overlap to neurocognitive or neurodevelopmental disorders like autism spectrum disorder. The direct brain alterations mimic any mental disorder, including schizophrenia. So if acute drug intoxication with, for example, PCP or ketamine can alter this effect, because PCP and ketamine both are NMDA receptor antagonists. And yeah, there's a trend to dimensional rather than to categorical approaches to further disentangle the broad concepts of psychotic disorders. Okay, now I will come to the computational modeling approaches to psychosis, and which lead to our work. I will skip some things, but basically we need a new approach. We need computational modeling so to get more predictive validity. We need to disentangle the broad diagnostic cluster of psychotic disorder to explain the heterogeneity between individuals and the variability of cores and mechanisms between and within individuals. So we need like multi-scale etiological factors that range from the molecular scale to psychological and social scales. As you can see here, there's inter-rater reliability of diagnosis, and yeah, for schizoaffective disorder, there's a reliability of 0.5. So we definitely need to explain the heterogeneity and variability between individuals. There are different model approaches. There are data-driven approaches, which are mainly machine learning methods that apply to machine learning algorithms to high-dimensional data to improve classification of disease, predict treatment outcomes, improve treatment selection, and all those approaches are generally agnostic to the underlying mechanisms, so they're agnostic to theory. Then on the other side, theory-driven approaches, which use models that instantiate prior knowledge or explicit hypotheses about such mechanisms. And yeah, this is possibly in multiple levels of analysis and abstractions. I will show you one example, but yeah, this could be a complete own talk about those computational models in psychiatry. There have been done a lot of work. Yeah, and then there are knowledge-driven approaches. I was defining them, I think, a bit different as they have been defined. So in contrast to those completely data-driven approaches, and in contrast to the theory-driven approaches, which use definite hypothesis and explicit theory, there are knowledge-driven approaches that use methods of the semantic web, ontologies, and literature mining, and that extract meaning from data from big data. So it's a bit in between both approaches. Yeah, model approaches, there could be the prediction of medication between different groups, and the theory-driven approaches that we quickly go through because this is super interesting, for me at least. You could use optimal models, so Bayesian models, to explain delusions and in schizophrenia. This is made with Bayesian models. So I hope you can see this. This is a hallmark delusion, and maybe you can just take a look at this and see. Yeah, some of you knows that. So there is just this rotating mask, and then note what you're perceiving or what you're feeling about this. So I will go further. You see the mask rotating, and at a certain point, even if the mask is hollow, so if it's convex or concave, it switches back, and you can't see the depth, the correct depth that goes into the backside of the mask. So that the nose that should be behind the cheeks pops out and comes in the front, and it seems like the mask is rotating in the other direction. This is modeled with a Bayesian approach to explain those positive symptoms in psychosis. So you have a prior belief that faces are convex, and there's a sensory evidence of a concave face. But because your prior belief is really strong, your posterior is shifted to the prior belief, and you see the face as convex and not as concave. And the correct depth, so the concaveness, is 3 times higher perceived in persons with people with schizophrenia compared to healthy controls. So it's theorized that there's a reduced prior precision, which shifts the posterior belief more to the real sensory evidence, which is not backed up by your prior knowledge about how the faces usually look like. So it is theorized that positive symptoms of schizophrenia are caused by an abnormality in the inferencing mechanisms of the brain. So you're drawing an inference based on your sensory input and your prior knowledge, and your cognition or positive symptom is then a result of a reduced prior precision. So this is one approach. Then back to the biomarkers, it is theorized that this depth perception can be a biomarker, but it didn't work out pretty well because there's a high percentage of the general population that does not transition to psychosis that are also seeing the depth correctly. So this as a biomarker doesn't work out pretty well, but there are different ones. And so genetics we've spoken about, then EEG signals, neurochemical markers, so levels of certain neurotransmitters, and some hormone endocrine levels, or for example, cytokine concentration or inflammatory, or in general inflammation that can be measured. And in the part here, there are the clinical symptoms. But we will focus on the structural imaging of gray and white matter in the next part, because I would just quickly want to show you a study of colleague of ours, Nikolaus Kousouleris from Munich, who approached the prediction of psychosis with a data-driven model in patients with clinical high-risk syndromes and recent onset depression. So this was a study, a huge study about personalized prognostic tools for early psychosis management with about 700 subjects, 167 with clinical high risk for psychosis, and the same number with recent onset depression. So there were different study sites across Europe and different data domains, so different variables were assessed. So psychological and clinical assessments, structural brain scans, and the polygenetic risk scores were calculated as well. This was a lot multimodal, so the 3 domains and longitudinal data with a follow-up testing 36 months later as well, or 9 and 36 months later. The goal was to predict the transition of psychosis using the clinical, the structural MRI, and the genetic model, and to assess what is the best clinical optimal workflow. Here in this study, the transition to diagnosis psychosis was defined as at least one positive symptom in a scale called structured interview for psychosis risk syndromes. And yeah, the psychotic intensity was reached daily for at least 7 days in this positive symptom item. Yeah, for the demographics, if you take 700 subjects, there was a sufficiently or substantially lower group of patients that transitioned to psychosis, so 26, 308 did not transition to psychosis. In the group of psychosis transition, 8 developed into schizophrenia, 23 stayed in the clinical high-risk state, and 3 were from the recent onset type depression group. This was the flow diagram. So they tried to calculate certain risk calculators, so certain models based on clinical features, the polygenetic risk score, or structural MRI-based models, and they tried to predict then the transition of psychosis in a test set. So those are the 3 models of the 3 modalities, and moreover, there was then a risk calculator that calculated that combined the 3 models in certain ways. So stacked all together or sequentially. So this has to do with an efficiency that only all modalities have to be included if the decision is vague. So if there's a borderline decision, so there has to be another modality included. So for the feature metrics, there was a cross-validation ratio and a sign-based consistency calculated. And for the structural MRI model, this looks like this. So you have voxels in the brain that are predicting the onset of psychosis if they are different from a healthy population. And the red one is volume gain, and the blue ones is volume loss. And here is a significant threshold basically for all voxels that have a predictive value for the transition to psychosis. For the clinical model, you see that family care, the correct face condition, and the motor disturbances were with high sign-based consistency, so they were highly significant, so predictive for transition to psychosis. And the accuracy of the clinical model was like 75%. Then there's the polygenetic risk score model, which imbalance accuracy of 6 to 6%. And then there is, as I showed you before, the structural MRI-based model. And based on this, a model was created using all modalities, which led to an increased accuracy up to 85%. You can see the model results here again. So here's the sequence model, the combined models, and the single modalities. So expert rating, clinical scales, risk score, and the structural MRI. But there's still the questions of what is the meaning of those predictive signatures? But we have a data-driven model, there's a machine learning algorithm, and it throws in data and somehow predicts a set. But we don't know how those mechanisms or what mechanisms are underlying those signatures. So, and that is the start of our current work, which I will quickly summarize because I think time has passed super quickly. So 5 minutes recap of the work. So we are trying then to use those predictive signatures that predict the psychosis onset, and we want to look at the underlying mechanisms behind them. For that, we used a software TV base, which is basically a automated meta-analysis tool that maps biomedical knowledge that is retrieved via literature mining software onto the 3D surface of the brain. So we type in some search queries that are annotated in the whole literature database of PubMed, and we extract the association to certain brain areas to the search query. So for example, we search a certain gene in the context of psychosis, and we get a result of all studies that associate this gene with the prefrontal cortex. This is another overview. So how this process is generated. There's a 3D template that is linked to an anatomic ontology. So each brain area is linked to a certain meaning and it's relating to other brain areas, and is understood in terms of synonyms and other concepts that relate to that term. And if we look in the literature, then we look through the natural language of the text, extract the anatomic terms, and relate it to the 3D template of the brain. If we then just reduce the literature database to only literature related to psychosis, for example, or only literature related to a certain gene in the context of psychosis, then we can extract the brain areas that are relevant for this search query and project it to a 3D brain template. This is working, so we internally validated it by just searching through concepts of brain areas, mapped these on the brain, and we see with a really high correlation that our queries relate to our anatomical assignment. For the external validation, we took another meta-analysis tool for comparison, and we get a substantially higher correlation and even higher accuracy of the maps produced for certain search queries, here for example depth perception or hallucinations. And we see that our TV-based maps on the top part have even more information content than the meta-analysis tool we used. That's the reason why the correlations are a bit lower, but the peak areas are still comparable. So in order to do a mechanistic explanation of the brain changes, we searched through a huge database of concepts, mapped them onto the brain, and then looked which combinations of those concepts, so genes, proteins, and genetic processes and metabolic processes and stuff like that. And we looked which combination resembles the pattern that we can see is predictive for psychosis onset. And then we want to look if we can extract certain pathways that resemble that spatial patterns in the literature. Our results show a good performance of our model, and which is not random. So just quickly go through. I just quickly go through the results because time is almost over. Yeah, so we can reconstruct the predictive signatures with associations with brain anatomy of many different proteins listed in the literature. So as you can see here, this is not perfect, but we can reconstruct the spatial patterns with a systematic and automated meta-analysis that looks for the spatial patterns in combination of different genes that have been reported in the literature. As a result, we get interesting features as top weights of this study. So there's the COMP gene, which is highly involved in psychosis transition with linkage to cannabis consume. There's serotonin receptors and different other genes and compounds related to glutamatergic processes, catecholamine metabolism, and inflammation. So if we then want to summarize all those features and all those genes that reconstruct the pattern that is predictive for psychosis, we get 3 clusters of pathways that explain again neuroinflammation, neuroplasticity, and dopamine metabolism. So we get a consistent proof that the mechanisms behind the predictive signatures are also the mechanisms behind psychosis, which is pretty cool, I think. So we can reconstruct the volumetric brain changes that are predictive for psychosis with spatial patterns that have been reported in the literature and have been linked to certain molecular pathways like nutrition, plasticity, inflammation, and metabolism. And this group average predictiveness or predictive pattern for psychosis can then be transferred into a mechanistic explanation, or this approach can then be transferred into a mechanistic explanation for individual brain abnormalities. So we can try to reconstruct an individual brain and the areas that are abnormal and see which mechanisms underlie this individual brain alterations. So this is the course one could head, but for now we managed to recreate the group average predictive patterns for psychosis. As a short outlook, this can also modeled with the virtual brain. So we have inflammation, we have this hyperexcitation pattern and the increased excitation or the shifted excitation inhibition balance. So in theory, one could also model this spatial pattern with certain parameters in mathematical models to resemble the predictive patterns that has been proven to predict and show psychosis transition. So this could be then the integration of data-driven, knowledge-driven, and theory-driven models into one mathematical model that resembles the predictive patterns seen in psychosis. Yeah, that is just the outlook where this could head. So thank you for the for your attendance and for the questions. Please ask any questions now if you have any left. So thanks for the attention.